This is the Middle-earth philosopher, where I talk about ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view that people in that world may have held. So, I have a question. Have you ever thought about paradise in Middle-earth? And what was paradise in Middle-earth? Moreover, do you think it was a good thing or a bad thing? I think this is something that kind of lies underneath a lot of the stories that happen in Middle Earth, especially in the first age. And in my opinion, I honestly don't think that it was worth it. And I'm going to go into my reasons why. To begin with, I think there were four paradises in Middle Earth. The first one being Elmarin, which was the original Middle Earth as it was intended to be before Melkor pretty much screwed it up. The second is Valinor, which is the remnants of Elmarin, where the Valar and the Maiar and the Eldar, that being the High Elves, lived during the times of the First Age and Second Age until it was removed from the circles of the world. The third might be a little bit controversial, but I would consider it a paradise since every time it's mentioned, it's practically considered one, is going to be Gondolin. And that was the city of the elves that was created by the Noldor within Middle-earth itself during the First Age, and was said to be almost equal in its representation of the original elven city of Tirion back in Valinor, which of course was the second paradise. And then the last one is going to be Numenor, or rather I should say Numenor before its decline. That being that it was the paradise for human beings in Middle-earth because of what it represented. The next question that is to be considered is, what are the parameters that I will consider paradise? What makes something idyllic or peaceful and separates that from a concept of something that is considered paradise? Well, the first parameter I would consider is that paradise is usually considered something to be separate from the rest of the world in some way, shape, or form. By that, I mean that paradise, under this definition, is some place that is considered sacrosanct. It's holy. It is untouched or pure somehow. That makes it untainted by the quote-unquote evils of the rest of Middle-earth or any of its corruptions or anything of that sort. And that this paradise is also a refuge for people who want to escape or not be touched or have anything to do with that corruption and evil. The second attribute of paradise in Middle-earth is rather a particular mindset or trend that I see in a lot of the characters throughout the stories who lived in these paradises. That being a sense of apathy that sets in regarding the rest of the outside world. You can see this with the inhabitants, of Valinor, where they live there after the fall of Elmarin, and after a time, they start to less and less think about Middle-earth or the consequences of what's happening there. Of course, there are exceptions, such as Umo, but for the most part, by and large, many of the people who stay in Valinor largely don't seem to care. Take, for example, the Teleri and the Vanyar elves. They are originally from Middle-earth, and yet they have zero love for it after they arrive in Valinor. They literally don't care, I would say at least. And the only reason that they returned to Middle-earth during the War of Wrath is essentially because the Valar told them to. Basically, that they worshipped them or respected them enough that they did what they said and believed in their cause. Or at the very least, with the Teleri, there was some resistance there because the Noldor had killed a bunch of their people way back when. So they were extremely reluctant to do that and just being very unforgiving. But they compromised and agreed to bring the army over, but they refused to set foot in Middle-earth after that. They completely forsaked it. So you have that example. Then in the city of Gondolin, you have the tendency of the Noldor, where after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, it's said that the people did not want anything to do with the rest of Middle-earth anymore. Their attitude was literally basically fuck the rest of the world, because it was too corrupt, it was too evil, there was nothing they can do about it, and they might as well just hunker in and enjoy the peaceful status quo and paradise that they had made for themselves in the city of Gondolin. And this was the mindset, even though they were getting messages and word that there were other elven realms that were falling, either to Morgoth or to civil war, something along those lines, that they were people who were looking for Gondolin, looking for refuge again, because Gondolin did have the reputation of being protected and unfound by Morgoth. So it was thought that that was to be the ultimate safe place in Middle-earth, and they were not having that at all. They were pretty much just like, fuck them. In fact, the only reason that Hurin and his brother Hur were allowed to return to the outside world was because they had convinced King Turgon that, they needed to go back to participate in the wars there, because that was them. And because of Turgon's closeness with them, he allowed it. But essentially, they just did not care. In Numenor, during the Second Age, it's said that the women of Numenor had little to no interest in the events and affairs of the outside world outside of Numenor itself. And even with the men, who were more adventurous, more outgoing, more extroverted, setting up empires and colonies and the like, that in the beginning at least, even though they did that, they always felt the urge to return. And in fact, I mentioned colonies earlier, that didn't happen until much later on, after their downfall, and by that point I would consider it no longer a paradise. So you have that element there as well. So that's what I mean by this element of a sense of apathy that just kicks in. To use an outside reference, if you will, it's like that movie, one Star Trek movie, where Kirk and Picard are caught in some sort of interstellar ribbon thing that grants them whatever paradise that they want, essentially, whatever their ultimate dream is. And once they're in that realm, in that dimension, they have no desire to return to the real universe anymore, because it's that addicting, it's that powerful. And I get that same sense with the inhabitants of people who live in these cities and or realms in the universe of Middle-earth. The third element that I would consider to be a requirement, I guess you could say, for paradise is the element of it being a reservoir of history and knowledge. Basically, that all these places were repositories for some sort of ancient knowledge or hidden world, or even more perfect world that had previously existed, that either no longer did or was under threat of being lost forever. So Almarin, for example, was the original Middle-earth, and Valinor was the remnants of that. So it was the preservation of that original Middle-earth as what it should have been. Gondolin was built in memory of Tirion, which was again in Valinor. And then you have Numenor, which was the preservation of the deeds and memories and heroics of their ancestors during the First Age. The next element I would say is a requirement in Middle-earth for paradise is actually kind of a dark element. It's a very kind of not evil, but disturbing one. And that is that it's considered so separate from the rest of the world that if for whatever reason you are allowed to enter, there is no going back. And you see this plenty of times throughout the history of the First Age, especially. For example, in Valinor, the elves who go to there basically are It's not that they're not allowed to go back, but they are told that it's not the best idea in the world, and they take that up at least until the Noldor do the rebellion. So there's this attitude there of that you shouldn't go back to this imperfect and darker or corrupted world. You also have that the Teleri, especially again, really adopt this to the point where they will not even set foot on Middle-earth. You have the mortal examples of Tuor and Eärendil, two of the only mortals who are basically allowed into that paradise, and even then, at least in Eärendil's case, he was flat out threatened with death from Mandos because he wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't allowed to be there, except he was there under certain special circumstances. But even then, he says flat out that, well, fine, he's allowed in, but he ain't going back. So you have Tuor, who's basically somehow made one of the elves so that he can live in the far west. Lucky him. And then you have Eärendil, who's basically doing his thing in the sky with the one Silmaril, and basically trying to give hope to people in Middle-earth, but he's no longer allowed to return there. He is no longer basically human at that point. Well, I don't know whatever the hell he will be, but that's kind of what seems to happen. And I already mentioned the examples of Hurin and Huor, where Gondolin was supposed to be a secret and they were not supposed to leave. And the only reason they were allowed to leave was because special circumstance, being the case of their relationship with King Turgon. So you have that element there. And then again with Numenor, with the aspect that the men of Numenor always felt a compelling to return west. So even though they explored outside the confines of their island, in their minds and in their spirits, those confines still existed. Again, at least early on. So that's that other element to paradise. So taking all these elements into consideration and everything, I go back to the original question. Is paradise in Middle-earth a good thing? Is it worth it? And to be honest, the reasons why I don't think it is because largely it seems like a source of trouble. For example, people who live in paradise seem to become complacent and are either taken advantage of or more easily deceived by evil forces and characters who manipulate their lax attitude in their world of perfection to do their evil deeds. The Valar are notorious for this during the early parts of the First Age. This happens with the Noldor, this happens with Numenor, and etc., etc., etc. So on the one hand, it seems like it's just trouble because it just makes people lazy and unaware. Another reason that I have for paradise not being worth it is that it's the apple dangling in front of the horse, as the saying goes. That it's this unreachable place or mindset that people, at least in a particular case, humans and some of the Noldor during the First Age, are told exists, but they can never go. But it's supposed to be this really wonderful place, and it's really too bad you can't make it there. Sucks to be you, and so on. And the result of that is being that every time, or at least most times, people try to go to that paradise, they end up getting killed. You have the Noldor who try to go to Valinor during their exile before Eärendil makes his trek there. You have the Númenóreans who, when they went to go wage war on Valinor to take their immortality from them and so they can have it, they end up, well, it says they get buried, but since there's no final battle, as it were. I'm just, to my mind, they're dead. So there you are. And then finally, you have just the act of Uru Iluvatar during the middle of the Second Age, just flat out removing the Holy West from Middle-earth, and in the process, also destroying Numenor. So basically, it's like God just stepped in and said, you guys cannot fucking handle this, so I'm just going to remove the whole thing from it, completely. And he takes every aspect of paradise, of holy perfection, and removes it from sight, so that now, unless, again, you get that special grace or that special case or whatever, no one can get there. So what was the point, And that's something even really to consider with the case of Elmarin, the original paradise, because it's said that Elmarin, was supposed to be this place where all of the creations could exist in one place. So if that was the case, then why suddenly change the rules after it gets wrecked? Why make it now that after that, mortality and immortality have to be two separate things? What was the point to Elmarin if the whole plan was that they would be separate in the first place? If you got an answer for that, please comment below. I would love to hear it, honestly. But that's just my thoughts on that. And then lastly, my last beef, I guess you can call it at this point, with the idea of paradise in Middle-earth is that ultimately it seems like a large portion of the populace of Middle-earth don't really give a fuck. And by that, what I mean is that it's never really a factor or temptation except to a certain few. So, for example, the elves of Middle-earth, the Morinquindi, the Dark Elves, they decide not to go there, and with the exception of some of the wars that happen, and even after that, by and large, they seem perfectly fine with that. They have no regrets about that, no issues, even though it's said that they will hear a calling to go west if they go near the sea. At the same time, they're perfectly fine living in, the woods and the forests and stuff like that. You have the dwarves who worship Ale. They know about him because of their religion and everything, but they have no urge or desire to sail west at all. And in fact, it's said they hate the sea. So they're fine carving out their mines and creating their underground mansions and, fighting wars and stuff like that. So, they don't care, really. And then you have your average human being in Middle-earth. So I'm not talking about kings and nobles and things of that sort, but I'm talking about just like your soldiers, your merchants, your everyday people, so to speak. And this is both for the men of the First Age and of the Third Age, where if they know about paradise, i.e. Valinor or even Numenor, then it's as a myth and a legend. And otherwise it matters very little to them, because what does it have to do with their daily lives? Pretty much nothing. The only time that they may have cared, and not in a good way, may have been during the period of time where Numenor was taking slaves and sacrifices from Harad, primarily, to kill in Numenor. So the downfall of Numenor would have been a good thing, even though it's said that, all this knowledge and ancient artifacts and everything was lost. They don't care about that, because one, they don't know anything about it, and two, they're not going to see it, and three, they're just being brought over there to die, not to, look at these artifacts and be encouraged and empowered or anything like that. So, fuck that, basically. So now, having taken all these elements and I mentioned my reasons and everything, this is why I don't think paradise was really worth it in Middle-earth, because ultimately it seems to me to be more trouble than it's worth. Either it is a place of separation from the other people around you that makes you less empathetic, or it is a temptation of a state of being or a place of living that you can never go to, and is more or less just kind of rubbed in your face, you know. So those are my reasons, I believe anyway, that I think that Paradise in Middle Earth was not worth the trouble.